Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today in this session on return to work. I'm going to be talking about the importance of workplace accommodations. I'll try to make the case that involvement of the workplace is a necessary condition for successful return to work in people with chronic pain, as well as other health conditions that lead to episodic disability. My email is here if you'd like to contact me after. Here are my financial disclosures. I have no relevant conflicts of interest with the topic of this talk today. I want to start with a quote from a paper written back in 1997 by the rheumatologist Norton Hadler. At this time, the American government was debating whether they should pass a national law to implement an ergonomic standard across all industries, putting strict limits on manual handling and other physical load exposures at work. Enforcement would be through punishments and fines if employers allowed their workers to lift beyond certain levels or with biomechanically unsafe postures. Dr. Hadler was very involved in this debate and wrote an editorial in Spine provocatively called "Back Pain in the Workplace, What You Lift or How You Lift Matter Far Less Than Whether You Lift or When." After disputing many of the prevalent ergonomic and biomechanical arguments around lifting at work, Dr. Hadler stated, "The solution to the conundrum of backache in the workplace is straightforward. There must be a national mandate to provide workplaces that are comfortable when we are well and accommodating when we are ill." Let me repeat, comfortable when we are well and accommodating when we are ill. Take a moment and think about your own workplace and whether it meets that standard. Is it comfortable? Is it accommodating? Now think about people that you know with chronic pain. Do their workplaces meet that standard? What even do we mean by accommodating or workplace accommodations? A collaborative project conducted in Ontario published a definition within the Employer's Guide to Workplace Accommodations. They defined workplace accommodations as adjustments made at any stage of the employment journey that allow a person with a disability to apply for jobs, interview, and fully perform the duties of a position. That's pretty broad, with some room for interpretation, but they go on to provide some helpful examples, which are shown here. These include things like improving accessibility by improving door openers, creating flexible or modified work schedules, restructuring work tasks to reduce load exposures, or providing modifying equipment or software to make work possible or more comfortable. Here's an example of a creative accommodation of my own workstation. This was aimed more at comfort, but I wanted a way to break up prolonged sitting at my computer after a knee injury. I'm nearly 2 meters tall, so the commercially available stand-up desks just don't work for me. I problem solved with our faculty technician, and this shelving unit, permanently mounted to the wall for my laptop computer with a footstool and anti-fatigue mat, was a great solution, all at a fraction of the cost of an actual stand-up desk. It's not perfect, but a good step in my own process of work accommodation. In fact, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that employers and service providers have a legal obligation or a duty to accommodate workers with health-related conditions so they can participate fully in work. The Canadian Human Rights Commission has a great description of the duty to accommodate on their website. Here they state that duty to accommodate means that sometimes it is necessary to treat someone differently in order to prevent or reduce discrimination. Chronic pain has been identified as a condition that causes physical disability and may require accommodation. Although there are reasonable limits to how far employers or service providers must go to accommodate needs, the website also states sometimes accommodation is not possible because it costs too much or create health or safety risks. This is known as undue hardship. Employers at times can claim undue hardship, but also must provide sufficient evidence. The Alberta Human Rights Commission website also has more information about undue hardship. They state that accommodation that is reasonable in one case may not be reasonable in another. Every case should be handled and assessed in an individual manner and in consultation with employees. One question that often gets asked is whether the added expense or burden of accommodations is worth it to employers. So from a humanitarian or human rights perspective, I would argue emphatically that yes, the expense of workplace accommodations creates a more equitable and fair workplace. From a healthcare perspective, I would argue that accommodations lead to a healthier and more sustainable workforce. But there is also growing evidence from an economic perspective that investment in accommodations in the short term leads to long-term cost savings. In 2018, a systematic review was published looking at the effectiveness of workplace interventions, including accommodations, for musculoskeletal, pain-related, and mental health conditions. The researchers found 36 studies examining the three domains of workplace interventions. These include work accommodations, health-focused interventions provided at the workplace, and service coordination. Strong evidence was found that time away from work is reduced by interventions that include at least two of these domains. They also found moderate evidence for a positive impact on cost outcomes. One study related to back pain found that every $1 spent on work accommodations and work-focused healthcare returned $40 in cost savings. So it definitely can be cost beneficial in the long term. Lastly, they found strong evidence that cognitive behavioral therapy interventions that do not include workplace accommodations or service coordination are not effective. So work accommodations are a necessary element of successful work reintegration and appear to be worth the cost through reducing long-term work disability. Another question that often arises is, how do we prescribe or determine what work accommodations are needed? Traditionally, these recommendations have been based on the load capacity model, where work capacity or ability is assessed and then compared to workload or required job demands. If capacity does not meet or exceed required loading demands, recommendations are then to either increase ability through rehabilitation or strengthening interventions, or to reduce workload through accommodations and modified duties. This engineering model has been relied on for decades. It has lots of intuitive appeal, and we know a mismatch between capacity and load is a good predictor of long-term work disability. But there are some limitations of the model when trying to assess capacity in fluctuating health conditions that cause episodic disability. And there are limitations around the measurement of work demands, which also fluctuate and can be unpredictable. But in general, this model has been a very useful conceptual foundation of work rehabilitation. There's several approaches to measuring both capacity and job demands. These come from the perspective of the worker or employer, and there are also attempts to quantify each through direct measurements. Each approach has strengths and limitations, and probably the best approach is to use a variety of assessments and bring all that information together into a return to work planning meeting, where everyone involved in the case can work collaboratively to discuss the situation, problem solve, and come up with an individualized solution through a participatory ergonomics approach. We know that top-down directive approaches to ergonomic changes in workplace accommodations are rarely effective. We often end up with compliance or uptake problems, and the generic solutions don't always work for individual cases. For sustainable uptake, all involved partners, and especially the worker, the employee with the health condition, need to have input and feel like their voice is being heard. This is really consistent with the spirit of Dr. Hadler's article, where he says, no individual should be expected to perform any task against their will, including any physical task that seems to the worker to be more demanding than that worker is comfortable meeting at that time. I want to say a little about work restrictions. These are often provided as a way of keeping workers safe at the workplace and avoiding re-injury. Blanket recommendations are sometimes given to people with health conditions like avoid heavy lifting, avoid awkward postures, and on and on. These also often lead to issues of compliance and become more of a barrier to recovery than anything. These types of restrictions are both difficult to implement at the workplace and may result in unhelpful beliefs, avoidance beliefs, and behaviors. So I would say that in the absence of medical contraindications to work, providing work restrictions does not promote work participation. I think that instead of thinking about restrictions and what can't a worker do, it's much more useful and meaningful to take a strengths-based approach and think in terms of workability rather than disability or work restrictions to inform workplace accommodations. What can the worker do now, and what else could they do if suitable accommodations were in place? How can we change the environment or equipment or schedule to help them do more activities and tasks which they are capable of. This is more consistent with the workability model developed by the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health, shown here. This model recognizes the many factors that influence sustainable work, including health and functional capacity. You see those at the kind of in the foundation of the house. But on top of that, you have values, attitudes, motivation. These all act within the broader social and physical environment. This model highlights the importance of taking a broad perspective on workability and collaborating with all partners to develop solutions. I've been talking mainly about pain-related conditions, but I wanted to share some new research results on the importance of work accommodations within long COVID, also known as long-haul COVID or post-COVID. The World Health Organization calls it post-COVID-19 condition. I'll start with sharing the story of Lance, who's a patient partner in our research. Lance had COVID in December 2020. He was admitted to hospital, isolated, and treated with oxygen. He recovered from that acute infection and was discharged home, but he experienced lingering symptoms, profound fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and assorted bodily aches and pains. These lasted for months and affected his personal life, his hobbies, and his work. Lance had developed long COVID. He was able to return to work as a clinical manager within Alberta Health Services, but he had many lingering limitations. He needed various physical and cognitive accommodations at work, as well as the ability to rest when needed and longer time to read or write reports. Unfortunately, Lance's story is not unique, and today thousands of people experience episodic disability and work limitations due to long COVID. The World Health Organization's definition is shown here. Basically, long COVID occurs when symptoms linger longer than 3 months after initial infection, and symptoms that cannot be explained by an alternative diagnosis. Over 200 symptoms have been reported, including joint and body pain. Prevalence estimates have varied since the beginning of the pandemic, with the most recent study from the Netherlands showing that 12.5% of people with COVID-19 infection go on to experience long COVID symptoms. I saw data from WorkSafe BC compensation claims for COVID infection last week that was lower at approximately 4%. But still, when you think of the 600 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide, this is a major new health problem. A survey conducted only in the United Kingdom identified 1.4 million people. That's over 2% of the UK population. And over 380,000 of these have had symptoms for 2 years. These numbers are staggering. The term long COVID was coined by patients who conducted several of the first studies and did advocacy to raise awareness of the problem. Several surveys have now been done that have identified the vocational consequences of long COVID. People with the condition often experience work disability in the form of absenteeism or presenteeism, where they're able to work but are less productive than usual. We know that service occupations are disproportionately affected, with healthcare, social care, and retail jobs being more likely to both be infected with the virus and be more likely to develop long COVID. So what exactly limits work participation? We know that cognitive impairment and fatigue limit return to work most severely, but pain and low physical function are also reported. There are some symptoms of long COVID and related post-viral symptoms that can profoundly impact workability. These include post-exertional symptom exacerbation, also known as post-exertional malaise. This is where even relatively small amounts of exertion lead to high levels of symptoms and disability, which comes on usually within the next 24 to 72 hours. Another common symptom is POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or other autonomic dysregulations are pretty common. As with chronic pain, these symptoms and the associated disability are episodic and often invisible, meaning that nothing can be seen on diagnostic imaging examination like MRI, CT, lung function screen, or even clinical examination. We don't know the specific biological mechanism causing long COVID, although research has led to several hypothesized mechanisms. These include a direct effect of the virus as it causes damage to various body tissues or organs, including the lungs, the brain, the heart. There may also be viral persistence through virus remnants or reservoirs in the body causing chronic inflammation. COVID infection may also lead to dysregulation of the immune or autonomic nervous systems, which may lead to the fluctuating symptoms. Autoimmunity has also been proposed. But at this point, we just don't know what causes long COVID. We have no diagnostic markers, and we have few treatment options available. Several long COVID rehab programs have been set up around Alberta. This includes one that's work-related. WCB set up the Millard Health Post-COVID program, which treats people with workers' compensation claims due to workplace exposure to the virus who develop long COVID. This is a multidisciplinary program offering flexible service delivery via in-person, if it's appropriate, or telerehab. Takes a psychoeducational approach for management of symptoms through pacing, energy conservation, breathing strategies, as well as activity or exercise if it's appropriate and tolerated. Most importantly, since it's a work-related rehab program, they offer advice about work activity, exploration of modified duties, and negotiation with employers about appropriate accommodations. We conducted a descriptive study using data from this Millard Health post-COVID program. We wanted to learn what are the descriptive characteristics of workers living with long COVID who participate in occupational rehab? And secondly, are worker characteristics, occupational factors, or health status at admission predictive of return to work at discharge from the program? This slide shows the demographic characteristics of our sample. 82 participants in the program. They're predominantly middle-aged females who are approximately 6 months from initial infection. They reported moderate levels of pain intensity, and disability due to pain on the Pain Disability Index. While the majority were employed at time of admission, only half had modified duties available at their workplace. And no surprise, at discharge from the program, 53% returned to work, and of those, 93% returned to modified duties. Our analysis of factors associated with return to work at discharge from the program found two statistically significant predictor variables. The most influential was availability of modified duties. Workers with modified duties had 3.4 times the likelihood of return to work at discharge. But along with that, duration of long COVID symptoms was also predictive, with longer duration between symptom onset and admission to rehabilitation being associated with lower likelihood of return to work. Our results are consistent with messages in the new Living Guideline on the Rehabilitation of Post-COVID Condition published by the World Health Organization. They have conditional recommendations for return to work action plans, as well as work modifications based on capabilities matched to work requirements, that old load capacity model. Last week, another document was published by Realize Canada that is available on their website. It is aimed more at informing policy. It's called Recommendations for Employers, Insurers, Human Resource Personnel, and Rehabilitation Professionals on return to work for people living with long COVID. These recommendations are also consistent with that WHO guideline, recommending prolonged and flexible suitable accommodations. But this document gets a little bit more specific with possible accommodations, identifying the need for modifications to both physical and cognitive work demands. So my take-home messages today are that work accommodations are essential to promote return to work from a variety of health conditions. And that combination of work accommodations plus work-focused clinical interventions conducted in the context of service coordination is really most effective for successful work participation. I want to give the last word to Dr. Hadler, who strongly believed that we all had a moral responsibility to support people with health conditions, including people with chronic pain, whose livelihoods were compromised due to struggles performing work duties. Returning to his paper, I quote, "All of us must cry out for empathy whenever another human being is having difficulty. Assistive devices, mutual assistance, and mutual understanding should be at hand." He also had a very strong message for employers, saying that management must be valued for valuing the human resource that is the worker. Thank you for letting me talk today about return to work and the importance of accommodations at the workplace. This is really such an important topic in the area of chronic pain, long COVID, as we've been learning, but really for any health condition. workplace accommodations are likely the best way to promote sustained and equitable work participation. If you'd like any more information about anything I talked about today or just generally on this topic, feel free to send me an email. There's lots of great resources available. I'm also happy now to open this to discussion.